Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first in the GeoTalks Express series. My name is David McKittrick. I'm Outreach and Training Manager here at Blue Marble Geographics, and I'm joined today by Mackenzie Mills. Good morning, Mackenzie. Are we reaching you today?
Yes, you are. Hello, David. Good morning.
Good to hear you. Good to hear. It's always good when the technology cooperates. Well, I should tell you, Mackenzie and I are appropriately distanced. I think we're about 50 miles apart. I'm going to guess, Mackenzie, about 50 miles. So we are obviously isolated. These are challenging times that we're living through right now, and we try to make the most. And hopefully today we can introduce to you a little bit of what we're doing at Blue Marble, and obviously continue our business practice, even though it has changed significantly. This series, the GeoTalks Express series, was an idea that we came up with after our full-day GeoTalks event, which was conducted 2 weeks ago. We had a fantastic day-long conference with speakers, etc. Most of you, or some of you, I would assume, had a chance to sit on at least part of that. When we were planning that, we had the idea to come up with an ongoing series, obviously, again, to address the fact that our business practices are changing. The way we do business is changing on a daily basis. It is extremely important to us at Blue Marble that we maintain communication with our customers, and this was the idea that we came up with. So today is the first. We will be conducting these every 2 weeks. Going forward into the foreseeable future, I think we have 8 scheduled so far, but these likely will be extended if the situation requires. And it does allow us to connect with you. You can see a little bit about what we're doing, maybe hear from some of my colleagues, hear from some folks in the industry, and obviously interact with us as well. You can provide us feedback as necessary. If you're interested in finding out more about the series, you can go to our website, and each one of these requires a registration. So I would encourage you to sign up because they have been very popular. So today's session, as you can see on the slide, is Getting to Know Global Mapper. This is an introductory session. The target audience for this are people who maybe don't know Global Mapper, haven't seen it, or maybe are aware of it and want to find out a little bit more. We're going to cover some of the basics today. Mackenzie and I will switch back and forth and introduce some of the very basic functionality. Before we begin, for those of you who have not attended a webinar with us before, a few things to cover. Mackenzie, do you want to tell us what to expect as far as the format is concerned?
I'd love to. So this is a online webinar, and the audience, the listeners here, are in listen-only mode. So if you talk, we cannot hear you, but feel free to ask some questions. If you have questions about what the workflows we're going through or other questions related to Global Mapper, there should be a questions panel as part of the GoToWebinar windows, where you can type in a question and we'll try to address as many as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and all registered attendees will get an email within a week with access to that recorded version of this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Mackenzie. So again, yeah, going forward, registering for the events is good because it means you will have access to the recording, even if you may not be able to attend. So we do encourage you to register for all of the events going forward. So back to today. We're going to spend the next hour, I'm looking at my clock, probably more like 55 minutes, going through some of the basic functionality of Global Mapper, introducing at a high level to various elements of the software. We're going to begin with a welcome. This is again targeted for people who don't know the software. I'm going to start by kind of giving you a high-level overview, pointing out some important features and functions, maybe looking a little bit at the navigation, moving around the interface. We'll load up some data and we'll play with it a little bit just to get comfortable how Global Mapper works. So, if you do decide to download a trial, for instance, at least you'll know how to interact with the software. Believe me, it's not difficult, but we'll give you a little bit of helping hand to begin with. I'm going to hand over to Mackenzie, and she's going to talk about the idea of loading data, a couple of different variations on that theme, getting data into the application. Again, remarkably simple, but we'll address that. Every workflow inevitably is going to require you to access some data, so we'll start with that. Coming back to me, I'm going to talk about the Digitizer. This is our vector editing tool, or vector creation and editing tool, I should say. So I'll spend a little time talking about the Digitizer and the functionality that it provides, drawing, moving features around, adjusting, etc. Again, Mackenzie will take over and kind of adding to the idea of working with vector data, she'll talk about attributes. And I think she has it in her back pocket. She's going to do a little exercise in thematic mapping as well, which kind of gives you a visual representation of attributes. We'll come back to me. It's like a tennis match. You're going to be looking back and forth. I want to talk about raster processing. We've been obviously the first couple of sections dealing mostly with the vector world, but we'll talk about raster processing. Very basic raster processing, things like adjusting the transparency, maybe do a little exercise in cropping some raster data, so look at some of the properties of our raster layers. And then we move into the good stuff. We'll talk a little bit about working with terrain, working with 3D data. It's very difficult to envisage working with Global Mapper and not in some way opening up the 3D view and looking at 3D data. That's the world we live in now, and our map data is reflecting that, obviously. So Mackenzie's going to introduce us to some of the important functions related to 3D, and I think I'll take over and add a few to her section. And then we'll wrap up by talking about map printing. It's almost like we have bookends here, beginning with getting data in, ending with getting data out, albeit in a printed form. Mackenzie's going to talk to us about our layout editor, the tool that lets us design a map for maybe printing or sending to a PDF. Okay, so first up is me. Let's begin with some basics, and I'm going to bring up the software. Hopefully I remember to load it, and I did. So you've seen Global Mapper. This, for those of you who have never seen it, and I'm sure there are a few of you, and by the way, we're going to ask you a little bit later if you have used Global Mapper before, so you can be ready with your answer. Yes, no, or which version. So be ready to answer a poll question a little bit later in our session. But for those of you who have never seen Global Mapper, welcome to Global Mapper. This is the software. If I was to ask you, having never seen the software, to load some data into the software, you could figure it out. We introduced Global Mapper by offering these buttons for loading data, for looking at some online data sources, which I think Mackenzie's going to show us next, for going to your configuration area to just apply some settings. Maybe you want to change the units of measure to match what you do locally, maybe metric, maybe imperial units. We'll jump to the bottom. You can even find out what training we have. And obviously training is kind of up in the air for us right now. We had some classes scheduled. We will be addressing that going forward, how we deliver training. Maybe a lot more online training will be available. So watch this space if you need some more hands-on instructional help. And then we have load default data. I'm going to click on that button. This pops up a map of the world. It gives you something to play with. If you're new to the software, you can at least look at some map data, figure out how to zoom, how to pan, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good kind of starting point for getting to know Global Mapper. We actually provide you a map to work with. Some of the important elements of the interface beginning our tour, obviously the map view itself, we've talked about already, the map itself, and then there's various map on-screen layout elements, including my scale bar you'll see at the bottom of the screen. We could maybe have a legend if we have some vector data representing features like Mackenzie's going to show us. We may have a north arrow if that's appropriate. So other elements could be added within the frame of the map. We have buttons that provide access to important functionality. Please don't be intimidated by these. It's kind of overwhelming as a new user to look at the array of buttons. Start with baby steps. We'll introduce some of the important ones today, and as you start to learn Global Mapper more, you will become familiar with the functionality that these provides. Moving then to the menus, obviously this is where we get to a few more advanced tools, including our analysis menu, which gives you access to all of the fun stuff like viewshed analysis, watershed analysis, density grid creation. All of the fun stuff is here. We'll not have a chance to do a lot of these today, but we certainly will in one of our future sessions. And finally, we have the control center. Now, to give this a little more context, I'm actually going to bring in some real data. I'm going to unload my world map. And from off screen, I'm just going to drag and drop a file. The file I'm dragging and dropping, by the way, is a workspace. So this is a Global Mapper proprietary file that, as you can see in my control center, contains multiple layers. I have 4 layers in this case. The ones that are visible right now are some imagery, and I have some parcel data here. We're going to be interacting with these a little bit later when we talk about the digitizer. So the control center is the area where we can do things like display or not display data as needed. We can apply settings to certain layers. I want to double click on my parcels. This is my vector layer, and you can see I can apply labels. I can adjust the style. I can determine what map zoom level this layer is going to be visible, within which map zoom layers it will be visible. So things that apply to a specific layer can be established right here in the control center. Also in the control center, you can apply settings by right-clicking. If I right-click once again, you can see we can do things like change the description, the name of the layer, in other words. We can zoom to the extent of a particular layer. We can bring up our attribute editor, which again, I believe Mackenzie's going to show us a little bit later. So again, multiple functions can be accessed from within the control center. So that's kind of, again, quick guided tour to the main elements of the software. Lesson one done. I'm going to get back to looking at the map view itself just for a minute, because by default, as you can see, we have a single map display, a single map view on our screen. I want to bring up a second view. We have a tool for adding a second 2D map view, and you'll see it specifically says 2D. That implies that there's a different tool for adding a 3D view, which we'll see later. But for now, I'm just going to click the button, and I'm going to add a map view. And by default, it will appear with the same data as the original. I'm actually going to dock this, and you can see as I move it around, these arrows appear, allowing me to dock. I'm going to dock it right beside the original, or the primary map as we call it. Now, by default, these are completely independent. So if I zoom in one, it will zoom, the other one does not move at all. We can link the two. We can link both the zoom level or scale, and we can also link the center, which is what I've done right here. Now, again, when I move on one map, I have to refresh, obviously, but when I move on one map, the other one will follow, and ultimately end up with two side-by-side maps. They're exactly the same. Not very useful, obviously. So in order to make this more useful, I'm going to determine what layers appear. Select the Select Layers function, and for initially the primary map, I can choose which of these layers to display. I'm going to turn everything off but my imagery. And we'll click OK. And you can see the parcels have disappeared from this view. I'm going to go to the second view, my 2D map view 1 as it's called. And again, I'm going to choose, this time I'll just isolate the parcels. Oops. And I will retain the layout elements, in other words, my scale bar in this case. And here we have an interesting perspective where we now have two side-by-side maps. I'm just panning on one side, and you'll see eventually the other one will follow suit. They're completely linked. It means I can work with my vector data and still see the context of where I'm working in the raster world. So it gives me the best of both worlds without a lot of clutter. Now, I've shown you two maps here. You can create multiple map views. You could have a second monitor with 4 separate map views all linked together, maybe with some terrain data, maybe with some vectors, different types of vectors, and maybe even bring in a 3D view as well, and they will all interact with each other when you're going through a process. Now, one final thing I want to show you before I hand over to Mackenzie, and that's the overview map. Right here in the toolbar, a little button kind of tucked in at the end of this menu array here, the overview map, once again displays, I was going to say it's a floating window. It had docked because I docked it before. It displays my location based on the full extent of my data. I'm going to actually dock this like it was before. I'm cheating a little bit here. And you can see where I am in this overview map with this little red dot. It also allows me to move around the map. This obviously gives me a geographic context, but if I click, it also lets me move, and I can obviously refresh the map as well. So this becomes a navigational tool. It also becomes, as its name implies, an overview of my extent, and this is going a little beyond my extent simply because the imagery itself, the actual tile, is much, much larger. That's why I'm seeing a much smaller kind of postage stamp size here. But that overview map is very useful. Again, I like to keep it right below the control center here. So that, in a very brief introduction, are some of the important layout and kind of functional elements of Global Mapper. I am going to do my best here to switch to Mackenzie. And Mackenzie, you're going to tell us a little bit about access to data, getting data into the software.
All right. Sounds good. So as David said, I'm going to talk about getting some data into Global Mapper and a couple different ways you can do that. So again, I just have the Global Mapper screen up, no data loaded at this point. And one way to open data would be to click on this text that says Open Data Files. You can also use a drag and drop method, as David did earlier. We also have a toolbar button to open data, or you can use the File menu. So there are a bunch of different ways to access the same function. Now, if I click on to open data, we have the Windows file browser that pops up, and it's worth taking a look at all the file formats that you can load into Global Mapper. Global Mapper supports over 300 file extensions for import. So as you can see, as I scroll down this list, it's fairly extensive. So data from a lot of different sources you can bring into Global Mapper, whether that's raster or vector. But for right now, we're just going to load a simple shape file. So I'll select my file, click open, and we will see that shape file of the United States load. So I'll zoom into a specific section of this data. And this is the island of Nantucket. It's an island off the coast of Massachusetts. And I've zoomed into a smaller area so that we can look at some online data. Now from this toolbar button, Connect to Online Data, we open an online data source dialog. And in this dialog, we've got a list of a bunch of sources. Now, these are all web services hosted on the internet where you stream data into Global Mapper. So if you don't have data files to load or you'd like some additional data, you can get them from online sources. To start, we're going to load just some world street map data. We're just going to load it for our current screen bounds to cover this island. And I'll hit connect, and we can now see that this gives us a little more information than that blank shape that I had loaded earlier. So we see the land area and the harbor. We've got this line here, which I know is a ferry line that goes out to the Nantucket Island. And this world street map data is really good for just giving a general reference, giving some context to the data that you're looking at. We'll take a look at a couple other online sources as well, one being World Imagery. So I hit connect here, and we've got imagery for this island. You can see it's patched together a little bit here. Blue Marble Geographics, we don't collect this data or keep it up. These are all publicly available sources for data that we just connect to allow you to easily bring that data into Global Mapper. So we've got some imagery. Again, you can see the outline of the island, the ocean area, the harbor here, and just some features on the land. Lastly, we'll look at some terrain data. So I'll just load some United States elevation data. This is about 10-meter resolution, and I'll click connect, load it for the same area. And we can now see that we have some terrain data. Now this is three-dimensional. It shows some relief, and we can see the red spots are high, and the blue, the ocean, is lower than the land area. We have our elevation shader here, which shows us the range of elevation that is being displayed. So you can export these data sources to their own files to store locally on your machine. You can right-click and go to Layer, Export, and for this layer, we're exporting an elevation grid, and we've got all of these options, and this is just to export elevation data. You can also export raster and vector data from Global Mapper, of course, but this will download the view of data that you have open in Global Mapper and save it to a local file. Going back to the online sources dialog, you also have the option to add a new source. Now this would add a new link to an online source. We do have all of these built-in sources, but if you know of another online source that you use commonly or that you'd like to bring data into Global Mapper from, you can add that source. And we've got some options here. Common ones would be a web map service or a tile map service. We also have the ability to add some feature services, which allow you to download and bring in vector data from an online web service. So that's just some basics of getting data into Global Mapper and how to, start looking at different areas of the world.
Mackenzie, thanks. I'm looking at some of the questions. And folks, just reiterating what Mackenzie said at the start, if you have questions, we have that questions panel. A couple of you mentioned sound issues, and that's inevitably something that happens when we're broadcasting. But nothing that we can control, obviously. There may be a local hardware issue that needs to be configured, but I think most people are actually hearing us, and we'll make sure we try to speak clearly so you can understand it if your sound isn't great. Sorry, the question for you, Mackenzie, someone is asking about if it's possible to stream OpenStreetMap data. Is that available in the online data sources? And I know the answer, but I'm going to wait for you to show.
Yes, I believe we do have OpenStreetMap data. If you could give me a hint as to
where
it's
under the worldwide
data.
It is a worldwide data set. OpenStreetMap, for those not familiar, is actually a global vector data set natively, and we offer access to the vectors. If you can see, you actually can download it from the OSM site, but we also have access to a rasterized version, which provides a really good backdrop. If you're working in a remote area and you don't have any base map, OpenStreetMap is a great way to access that. And also, just kind of putting a plug in for the OpenStreetMap project, go to osm.org and become involved in the project, because you can also contribute to the data in your area. So a little bit more of an answer than you're expecting. The answer was yes, you can, but a little bit more of an explanation. Okay.
Yeah, so as I'll show here that all of these folders are expandable. They contain more folders with more sources. So this is quite an extensive list of built-in online sources
Yeah,
for you
and
to
actually,
browse through in
it's an
Global
interesting
Mapper.
part of the software, because it is actually something that we can control in real time. It doesn't require you to update the software to get an updated list, and we're continually looking for additional sources that we need to add, or indeed retiring sources that are no longer available. So it's a dynamic part of the software. So okay, back to me, Mackenzie.
That sounds good.
Okay, let's come back to Earth here and back to our little parcels area. Now, next bullet we introduced was working with vector data, using the digitizer essentially. We could spend all day, all of our session, indeed we could spend all of the GeoTalks Express sessions talking about the digitizer. It's a very powerful and expansive and extensive tool. We're going to introduce it as a very basic level today. The digitizer at a high level is controlled by the button in the toolbar. You see where my cursor is located. It looks like a pencil. And if you select the pencil or the digitizer and you move it over your map, it's difficult to see with the imagery behind, but it says edit. In its native mode, the digitizer is an editing tool. It's waiting for me to select something. It's eager for me to click on a parcel so it can do something with that parcel. That's its native function. So I'm going to duly oblige here. I'm going to select a parcel, and you'll see it's highlighted. In its highlighted state, you may have noticed in the toolbar, it triggers a lot of options. I can now move it if necessary. I can rotate it and scale it. I can transform my polygon into points or transform my polygon into lines. I can buffer it. I can do all sorts of fun things with that selected feature. So the sky's the limit. That works singularly, or indeed it works collectively. Now again, I have multiple objects selected. I can go to town. I can delete them. Obviously, that's a common one as well. I can delete a object in a layer. Quick housekeeping issue, just so you know, if I was to delete these selected parcels, they would not be deleted from my source layer. The layer that I imported, I don't have the original name here because I changed it, is actually a shapefile. Deleting them in Global Mapper has no effect on that shapefile, and that's an important housekeeping consideration, because it means you're not destroying your source data. It's always going to be intact. Any edits that you apply are saved internally within Global Mapper. You can save a workspace to preserve those settings and ultimately export the results of your edits to a new file if you want. So just kind of a quick housekeeping consideration when you're working with vector data. So in its native mode, as I mentioned, it is an editing tool. But that's not fun. Let's talk about how we actually create stuff. The primary functions for drawing in Global Mapper are right here, beginning where my cursor is located. These are my points, a couple of flavors of lines, and then 3 flavors of polygons. Obviously, points, just click on the map. You select a location, you drop a point, and you have a point. Lines, similarly, you click, click, click to draw, or you click and hold to draw in what we call trace mode. And then we've obviously got squares and circles. Click and drag to create a square, click and drag to create a circle, or an ellipse if you hold your shift button down. And finally, one in the middle here is the one we use probably most commonly, is to create an area or to create a polygon. I'll go ahead and grab that one just as an illustration. Moving my cursor out onto the screen. No longer does it say edit. It's, again, quite difficult to see, but it says area. I'm going to be creating an area here. And if I move my cursor close to one of the existing boundary lines here, you see it really wants to snap. There's a kind of a pixel threshold that can be adjusted that dictates how close you need to be to snap. Some people like snapping, some people don't. You can disable that. That's one of the options in the configuration area. You can also stipulate that it only snaps to an existing vertex, and I can do that as a shortcut by holding the V key down on my keyboard. You're not seeing that obviously, but I've got my finger on the V key. Now it doesn't want to snap until it gets close to one of the shape points here. As you can see, again, right at the corner. And that allows you to make sure that whatever you're digitizing is going to snap nicely into where you want. Now, the actual digitizing process, very simple. Click, 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 click. and finish. I'm just going to right click to finish, very quickly showing you this dialog box. This is where we can assign all of the characteristics that are necessary to this new feature. We can put it in a layer, probably most important. I might want to call this parcels or polygons or fields or whatever it is that I'm drawing. I can assign it a feature type, which allows me to determine what it will look like. And I can also add attributes. I'm not going to do that. I won't talk anymore. Mackenzie's going to introduce the attribute management function in our next section. But this is the management tool for assigning our feature to a layer and applying certain characteristics. I'm going to cancel. I'm not going to keep this one in this case. Now, the final thing I want to show you in regard to the introduction to the digitizer kind of goes into another level, because we've been considering these features from a high level to begin, a whole polygon, if you like. But we also can display the individual shape points or vertices for all of these features. Now you see all these blue dots on the screen. When I was snapping, by the way, that's what I was snapping to, were these vertices. I'm going to actually move over here slightly, so a polygon with a collection of vertices. I can select, oops, that's a hole in a polygon. Let me go somewhere else. I can select an individual vertex, and I can not just modify the shape itself, but I can modify that vertex. There is an entire menu, if I right-click, of vertex editing tools, where I can obviously delete the vertex, I can move it, I can specify a location. If I know exactly where the vertex should be, I can specify that location. I've also got options for inserting new vertices as well. You may notice in Global Mapper there are occasions where you have a little graphic element in a menu here. This is simply a visual cue that there's also a toolbar button that does that. So you can bypass the menu and go to the toolbar for that purpose. So I'm not going to again go any further, but suffice to say, with the digitizer, you can create or you can modify shapes or features, points, lines, polygons in whatever way you want. Now, you're going to take this to the next level, Mackenzie, and you're going to talk about all the important stuff that's associated with these vector features. You're going to introduce attributes.
Yes, I am, David. So, to talk about some attributes, let me share my screen here. All right, I've got a shapefile of a lake up. This is St. George Lake in Maine, and as you can see, I do actually have some of that world street map data thrown in behind it just to give us a little more context and make this map look a little bit more interesting. So for this lake, I also have a layer of lake depth points. So these are points that someone has gone out and collected. They've sounded the bottom of the lake and figured out the depth at all of these different point locations. So to see some of the attributes for one of these point vector features, because right now they're just displayed as black points, that's not really giving us any meaningful information. To view some attributes, we'll use the feature info tool here, and we can click on one of these points. See, it's highlighted now, and we have this feature information window. Now this gives us the point location, the layer name that the point is in, and then all of our attributes and values for this one specific point. Now there's a lot of attributes here, but this being lake depths, the ones that we're interested in are depths in meters and depth in feet. So that lets us view the attribute information for one feature at a time. Now this can be area features, point features, line features. We're using point features as an example. To view the attributes for all of the features in this layer, we would right-click on the layer and choose to edit attributes. And this brings up a big table called the attribute editor. And this lists all of the features in the layer and all of the attributes for the features. It's a big table. We can see we can scroll across and see all of those attributes. So this window is also dockable. You'll see those arrows pop up if you would like to dock it. You can also resize it or move it to a secondary screen. I'll just make it a little bit smaller to show that when I select points or features in this table, they are selected in the map view. So that's another way you can identify and pick out specific features based on an attribute value or a specific feature name that you're looking for. So some other things that we can do in the attribute editor or add attributes to our features. There's a couple ways we can do this. The first is to just simply click this button here to add a new attribute. We would name the attribute and then enter the value. And we're just gonna name this as the lake to let us know that all of these points are in fact contained in Lake St. George. We click OK. Global Mapper informs us that it's added an attribute for all of our features. And we can scroll to the end of our attribute list and see that we've added that lake attribute here. And that's just one attribute value applied to all of the features in this layer. The other option to add an attribute would be to calculate a new attribute. Again, you'd enter an attribute name, and then you could either use a simple calculation using one of a few different more basic methods to calculate a new attribute based on an existing attribute, or you could use a formula calculation, and this is a more extensive list of some formula operators. You can use existing attribute values as a jumping off point, and these are all well documented for Global Mapper as well. If you are looking to do some more advanced attribute calculation, there's documentation on all of these different functions. One other thing we can do in the attribute editor is to search our features. So clicking on our search button, we have this search vector data window that comes up. And we've got our attribute list here, and we'll select depth. We double click on that and it populates in our query down here. And if we click load values, it will load all of the values for the selected attribute. So these are all our unique depth values that are present in our features. So we'll create a simple query to search for depths over 40 feet. And we'll click search, and you see that this updates our attribute editor. Not all of our features are showing now. We're just showing features with depths over 40 feet. We can close our search vector data dialog, and I can select all of these features, and we can then see that these are our deeper points in the lake. These are our depths over 40 feet. So that's some way you can work with your data and identify specific features based on attribute values. I'll close the attribute editor now, and we'll talk a little bit about some basic thematic mapping. Now, if I wanted to show the depth visually for all of these points, we would want to change how they look. They're all appearing as just black point symbols. To change that feature styling, we'll open our layer options by right-clicking and choosing options, and would go to the point styles tab. Now you've got a bunch of options here, and we can just simply change the styling of all of our features so they all use the same styling. We can change that from a black dot to a green dot if we'd like. And we click apply, and all of those point features are now displayed with a green dot. Another option would be to apply styling based on an attribute value. So selecting this option allows you to select the attribute. Again, you would probably use a depth attribute for this data set. That seems to make the most sense. And then in this empty box here, we'd go through and we'd add our values or load our values from the attribute table, and then assign different stylings based on different depth thresholds that we'd like to display. Now, since that can take a little bit, I'm just going to cancel out of this dialog, and I have a layer of the same lake depth points that I have already added some styling to. So you can see I've just enabled that layer, and we've got points where the lighter colored blue points are shallower areas, whereas the darker are deeper areas. And we can take a look at our layer options point styles tab, and you can see I have the same apply styling based on attribute name or value with a depth, and I've added some point symbols in varying blue colors to show as our points have a higher or a deeper depth. So that's just some basic thematic mapping that you can do in Global Mapper, and this can be applied to not only point features, but area features and line features as well.
Mackenzie, questions, a lot of questions, and I'm going to answer a few after Mackenzie wraps up, but something, question specific to what you've just done, Mackenzie. The styles that you've just created, can they be saved for another map? I guess if you're doing multiple lakes, do you have to do this again and again, or can you save it?
You can absolutely save it. So you can save a style file or an SLD file. This will save out a text file that you can then, in another layer, click load style file and load that same attribute styling, and it will save the attribute and the value thresholds you have set here into a file that you can load for another layer.
Excellent, excellent. A few other questions while we're transitioning. All set, Mackenzie? Can I take back the screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
I'll throw it back to you.
While I'm trying to do this, I want to multitask, bring my screen back and read questions at the same time. A couple that were asked in the aftermath of some of the earlier sessions. Someone asked about projection. What projection does a feature retain? Global Mapper's approach to projection is whatever layer you load first defines the on-screen projection. Each successive layer that's added, regardless of its native projection, will be reprojected on the fly. That happens automatically. At any time, you can reproject. Simplest way to do that is to double click where my cursor is located, and you'll see the projection. This is UTM right now, zone 19, but you can reproject here. Reprojecting the on-screen display will allow you then to export whatever layers you need in that new projection. That's how reprojection works in Global Mapper. So that's a very basic kind of overview of how Global Mapper deals with projection. Other questions, someone mentioned about undoing. If I delete, yes, Control Z or Control Z, depending on where you are in the world, will undo a deleted feature, so don't worry. A lot of people are asking about the video. Yeah, we will be uploading the video. Some people asking about some of the embedded data, the background data to some of the online sources. One thing Mackenzie didn't have a chance to show, but if you right-click on any of those sources, it will allow you to go to the source, wherever that is online, and it will provide all the metadata right there. You can see the capture date of the imagery, and you can also see some of the copyright information as well. If you're going to reproduce this in some way, you can go and read if you're able to reproduce it. So right-click on any of those services in the online data dialog box, and it will take you right to the website to give you the latest information. So again, keep those questions coming. With apologies, we can't answer them all, but I do promise you we will, by way of following up, cover all the questions and answers that we need. We'll hand these over probably to some of our tech crew. Okay, so back to me again. Mackenzie gets to do all the fun stuff. I'm back to the kind of the boring world of just top-down data and boring imagery, but that's okay, because I want to introduce some of the tools for working with raster data. We have the imagery here that we had before. Very quickly, worthwhile noting, double-click on the imagery, and it brings us options that we can use to adjust the display of the imagery. As you can see, color intensity, slider back and forth, translucency, the overall transparency or translucency, opaqueness, I guess, of the image can be adjusted, again, with a slider, or you can specify an individual color. I'll actually do this in a minute with a different layer where you specify the transparent color. I'm also going to talk about blending a little bit later. In fact, I'm going to do a little texture map exercise. Hopefully not take up too much time. But other options in here include feathering. You can adjust the color contrast, color grade adjustment, and again, map zoom as well as here. You can define the zoom level for any given layer, as well as other settings as well. So again, high level options pertaining to an image. Also worth noting, if I right click or I can double click and hold the M button on my keyboard, brings us the metadata for that imagery layer. And this obviously is also applicable to vector data as well. The bounding coordinates of the layer, the projection information, and probably most importantly for what I'm doing right now, the resolution, the pixel width and pixel height, which right now is 20.25 meters, 25 centimeters. So I can get a snapshot of what data I'm working with by opening the metadata. One of the functions, one of the tabs you may have noticed in that options dialog box, and a very common workflow when working with imagery, is the option to crop imagery. I'm actually going to select 3 of these polygons just randomly. I'm going to go back into that area again. I'm going to choose cropping, and I'm going to crop to my selected polygon. And I will crop to all. I'll say yes, and I'll click OK. And lo and behold, I've simply used the outline of some parcels to remove imagery that I'm not interested in. Now, again, it has no effect in the external file that I loaded. Simply Global Mapper's display has been adjusted. So I'm just seeing these three little areas, I guess, or the imagery corresponding with these three areas. And fear not, I can bring it back very easily again, go back into cropping, and no cropping. We'll bring it back to the way it was. So we're back to the way we were. So quick workflow that's quite common. I mentioned about transparency. Let me show you that again very quickly. I'm going to turn off my parcels now, and I want to turn off my imagery as well. I'm going to bring up a topographic map. Let's zoom out a little bit so it looks a little bit better. Again, this is a raster layer, but I'm going to make a couple of the background, a couple of the colors transparent in this layer. Basically, it's another option. Double click, go to the transparency option. You can set the transparent color here. Which colors do I want to be transparent? I'm going to drag this out of the way slightly so I have a better view of the map. Because this is a limited palette index, this is actually quite simple, but I could also, if necessary, pick from the map. If it was like a top-down standard aerial image, I could choose a color in that image to make transparent, or indeed more than one color. Just for illustration purposes, I'm going to click my white color and click OK. I'll click Apply or OK. Either will work. The apply keeps the dialog box open. OK closes the dialog box. And to see that that actually worked, I'll turn on my imagery again. And you can see it's kind of crude looking, but you can see I've been able to knock the background color out of that map so I can see what's visible underneath. Let's go back again and we'll turn off our transparency. The final thing I'm going to do requires me to turn on an elevation layer. Mackenzie's going to introduce us to elevation formally in just a second, but by way of kind of whetting your appetite or a little trailer here, I'm going to do a blend here to blend this raster layer with the underlying image. I'm actually going to do a texture map, which is very, very cool. Once again, it's an option for the raster layer that I select, the topo map in this case. I choose texture map, and what happens is it will look at the underlying terrain and actually bring in that texture so that it's transposed into this top raster layer. We'll click OK, and I have this really cool textured topographic map showing me what's displaying from underneath. If I export this to a new raster image, it will export what it sees on my screen. So it's a really, really cool function. So that was just a whistle-stop tour of some of the more interesting raster processing, raster editing, raster visualization tools. Now Mackenzie gets to do the real fun stuff. Actually, let me pause briefly. I promised earlier, I was going. You guys have been sitting watching for a while. Time to participate. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to select a poll here. You'll see this on your screen in just a second. I want you to tell us which version of Global Mapper you're currently using. You have current version, previous version, or version before that, and then older version if you're still on version 19 or previous. And obviously we're interested in hearing from you if you're not using Global Mapper as well. I'll give you 10 more seconds to respond, and then I can actually turn around and show you who you're sharing the webinar with this morning. Okay, time's up. Let's see if I can share that. And you should be seeing that on your screen. So there we go. Quite a few of you are not using Global Mapper. Well, hopefully this is useful for you. Hopefully after today, you'll go ahead and grab a trial copy, download it, and put it through its paces. A few of you are up to the current version. Quite a few of you on an older version as well. Again, maybe in a future session, we can introduce you to some of the new tools we've added recently. So thank you for your participation in the poll. And at this stage, I am going to switch back Mackenzie, and Mackenzie, you're going to tell us a little bit about terrain.
Yes, I am. So starting off here, I've got a layer of imagery, just some background for our area, and I also have a point cloud. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, a point cloud is points in 3D space, so each point has an X, Y, and Z, giving it a coordinate location and an elevation. So this is 3D data. And right now we have it viewed by elevation, so we can see the low spots in blue and the high spots in red. And we've got our shader up here as well. Now, to create an elevation grid, a gridded surface layer from this point cloud, we would use our Create Elevation Grid tool. And you can grid any 3D vector data. So any vector data that has elevation associated with it. We got a few questions about creating a grid or contour lines from the lake depth points that I had up earlier. And so you could do that with that depth value. We're going to do this with the point cloud. We'll open our elevation grid creation options, and we've got some options here. We're going to use a triangulation method, which will connect all of the points in this point cloud into some triangles and then create a surface grid from them. So I actually already have these layers created. We can turn on our surface. We'll disable our point cloud and our imagery. So we're just looking at this one layer. And you can see it's still shaded by elevation here. And as we zoom in, you can see that it does have some texture. You can see that it does look three-dimensional. I also have this vector tin that you can save. And these are all the lines and faces connecting those points of the point cloud that went into generating this surface layer. Now, this does look like it has some relief and that it is three-dimensional, and that is because we have some hill shading applied. And you can see this is enabled. If I disable that, it doesn't look as three-dimensional. We still see that it has that variation and elevation. We have that described by our elevation shader and the colors displayed, but it doesn't have that shading because no light sources are being applied. We can enable that hill shading again and then work with our dynamic hill shading to help change where that light source is coming from. So we have our light source here and we can move that around. And as I do this, you can see that it does change how that elevation grid appears in this 2D view. So that's just an interesting way you can use to highlight a specific feature or get a more detailed relief view in 2D for a 3D layer like this. Another option we have with an elevation grid like this is to change the shader. So by default, the Atlas shader is used, which goes from a minimum elevation in blue to a maximum elevation in red. And we can change that with this dropdown. A good one to look at would be a slope shader. Now, instead of shading based on the elevation values, this is shading based on the slope values. And again, we have our shader legend here to describe what the shaded colors mean in this layer. In Global Mapper, you also have the option to add a custom shader if you'd like, and that's designing your own shader based on elevation or slope values to use your own color scheme or highlight specific values you'd like to look at. I will change this back to the Atlas shader, and then we'll actually open our 3D viewer and look at this layer in 3D. You can see that it is in fact 3D. We can see that relief. And this is just another way you can look at 3D data. You know, you can pull 2D data up in the 3D viewer as well, but it's not really that meaningful since it would just appear flat. Whereas you can see that this does have some change in elevation there. One last thing we can do is to create a fly-through. And this is just another way to visualize your elevation grid or that 3D data. So I have a line feature that I've digitized. It's showing up very faintly, but I can select that with that Digitizer tool is what I used. And I just clicked on that line to select it. And then we click on our Create 3D Fly-Through. And this is where you can set the parameters. We're just going to fly along this line looking straight ahead for a short duration at an elevation of 15 meters above the ground. We'll generate our data, click OK. And then in our 3D viewer again, we can hit play, click OK, and we'll see Global Mapper flies us along that line in 3D, so you can get a better sense of what that terrain looks like. You can do this from a lower elevation as if you're walking or around a specific feature, but it's just another way to visualize that 3D data. So that's just some basics of creating an elevation grid from vector data that has elevation, and some different ways to visualize it and view it in Global Mapper.
Excellent.
Now I'll pass it back to David, who I think is going to talk to you a little bit more about some things you can do with an elevation grid
Yeah,
visualization.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually looking at questions here. Gosh, you guys are asking a lot of questions. I'll answer a few of these before I take back or while I take back the screen. But again, if we don't have a chance to answer yours, they're all recorded. We know who you are. You registered. We'll send an email with a response. Somebody's asking about contours less than 1 meter or 1 feet. Absolutely. I'll show you the dialog box in just a second. Someone asked about image registration. Can we do image registration in Global Mapper? And easy answer to that is absolutely. There's an image registration function. Sorry, Mackenzie, I mentioned I would take back the screen. I have the screen back again. So image registration, rectify image, georeference imagery. If you have an external file you need to register. Mackenzie answered a couple of questions about generating contours from the lake points. Somebody mentioned a heat map. There's a heat mapping tool as well. If you want to do a density map of a point distribution, a little bit more involved in what we're going to be doing today, but that is certainly available in the software as well. It seems like there's a consistent answer yes to all of these questions. Contours and point data again. We'll try to answer many of these as they come in. Keep asking the questions. Someone asked about the resolution of data that was cropped. If you export that data, what's the resolution? It maintains the resolution of the original, or you can define that during export as well. The export dialog box will allow you to define what that resolution is. So you've complete control, but by default, it will be the resolution of the file that was imported. So, okay. I got a couple of things to do here. We're slowly running out of time. This will not take long. Contours was mentioned before. Contouring Global Mapper is one of the more common functions that's used when you're working with terrain data. And I'm just quickly going to generate some contour lines for this screen area. One more button from the toolbar, our Create Contours button, where my cursor is located. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but we can define things like the contour interval. And someone mentioned if it can be less than a meter, do decimals in here. Absolutely, no problem. You can specify a height for a contour rather than making an interval. And you can also generate areas as well as lines. I actually did this in a recent workflow. That's why it was switched on. We've added a tool recently for locating peaks and depressions within an area. Local high points, local low points, which is useful. And we can also define the high point and low point over the extent of the full area. A spot height indicating where the high point, if you're putting in a transmission tower or something, is a useful tool. So I'm not going to go into, again, any more details. This will generate a new vector file. In the interest of time, I'm going to limit this to my screen. A few options in here to define the extent. I could draw a box manually. I could crop to an area. If I just want contours inside a polygon, I don't have one, obviously, so that's not available. Or just on my screen. I'm just going to do contours on my screen. Click OK. And it should not take long. We have some really cool contour lines. I forgot to turn off the peaks and depressions. So you're seeing the local peaks in here as well. Those little triangular shapes are the peaks. So vector lines, these are now exportable. I'll turn off the underlying elevation layer. They can be modified, they can be queried, they can be even displayed in 3D, which is kind of cool because they're 3D lines or 3D features. So here we have them in their 3D context. Let me close that window. So, and ultimately export it as necessary. So contouring is very simple, very straightforward process. Final thing in regard to terrain is our profiling tool. This is another way of visualizing terrain. This is a cross-section tool, if you like, to give it a kind of a layman's term, right? Where my cursor is located, it's called Path Profile. And we can do this a couple of ways. We can either draw a line manually, or we can apply a profile to an existing line. So if you have a shapefile or something of that type, maybe you've imported a layer with linear features representing trails or roads, and you can profile those against the terrain. Regardless of which method, when we create our line, it appears as a floating window, which again can be docked. I'll just dock at the bottom of my map view. And you can see now as I transition along that profile, my location represented in the view above. I can zoom. Maybe I want to zoom into this peak. You can see where I am in the full regards to the full extent. And there are a number of additional tools that can be applied with this profile, probably the most important of which is a view shed analysis. Line of sight analysis, where you can define a artificial elevation for a start point and for a destination point and determine if there's any obstructions along the way. So this is just a little snapshot into kind of some of the terrain analysis functions. We will get to those in one of our future sessions where we spend the whole hour going through some of the terrain analysis tools, view shed, watershed, line of sight, etc., etc., etc. So again, that's just a quick kind of summary of some of the terrain functions. I'll close my profile view. And Mackenzie, back to you for, I think, our final session here. We're going to talk a little bit about our map layout tool.
Yes, talking about the map layout tool, we actually did get a question about this, about creating a map with some title elements and other features that you could use for printing or electronic distribution in more of a static format than this dynamic working with data in Global Mapper. So to do that, I've got an example map loaded here. We've just got a small area, a town in Minnesota, I believe, and I've got these area features colored by the zoning. So to create a map for printing or other distribution, we can use our map layout editor. We click here and I've already got a map layout set up. You can customize this layout, paper size, data view, scale, all of those parameters, and you can add elements to this map. We've already got some added. Of course, we have our data here. We've got a scale bar, a legend, and a little graphic for Holly, which is this town. Now, one thing this map is missing right now is a title. So to do that, we can go to our insert menu and add a text element. And so you can add any text you want here. I am just going to name this Holly Zones. That is what our map is describing here. And then we can select our font. And this gives you options to add some font effects and choose a specific font. We are going to keep it consistent and choose a larger font because this is the title for our map. We'll click OK, and we can see that that element is now added. And I'm just simply clicking on and dragging this element around to position it. You can do this with any of the existing elements as well. If I'd like to reposition our legend here, I can move that around. And we can set our title up right there. And from here, you can save this map. You can export it to a PDF or print this out, whatever you would like to do as your next steps. So that's just some very basics of creating a map from data that you have loaded in Global Mapper.
Yeah, and the PDFs are actually a kind of a special flavor PDF. They're actually geospatial, so they actually retain their geographic intelligence. You can load it up in an Acrobat, for instance, and enable the I think it's called the geospatial tool in Acrobat, and actually see coordinates. You can measure in real world units. So that geospatial PDF is a very cool format. Thank you, Mackenzie. We are almost out of time. There's probably about 50 questions here, which if I had another 15 minutes, I would love to answer. I'm going to go through very quickly again as I transition back to my screen and answer them as quickly as I can. Free LiDAR data? Yes. Go onto the online data sources. You'll see a LiDAR manual. For those in the US, we provide direct access to the national map. It'll show you what LiDAR data is available free. Can you look at areas of a certain slope percent? Yes. In fact, you can vectorize that slope view. You can create vectors and then query the vectors to determine the range of slopes that you need. Can you save the fly-through as a file? Yes. MP4 and AVI files can be generated. Somebody asked about how we do contouring. I just showed that. What's the tree button do? I've turned off the interface. Those are part of our LiDAR toolbar. If you want to find out, come back next week or the week after next, and we're going to introduce the LiDAR module, all of the fun stuff we can do with point cloud data. Can you export the profile? Yes, you can. Somebody's asking about a CSV file specifically. Yes. Two people asked, is the profile view vertically exaggerated? Yes to that. It's exaggerated to the extent of the window, but you can adjust it. There's all sorts of settings. You can make it 1-to-1 if you want. Believe me, if we had done a 1-to-1 match on our view, it would have been virtually flat along the bottom of the screen. Okay, with apologies, there's a few more in here. I don't have time. We're getting towards the end of our session. All that's left for me to do is to thank you for attending. Thank you for taking an interest in Global Mapper and for all of these questions. These are great questions. I promised we will throw these over to the experts and you will be getting a response to these within a couple of days. As Mackenzie mentioned at the start, we are recording this, so you can watch this all again. I know it was a high-level overview. We will get into more depth in certain areas of the software as we go forward with our GeoTalks Express series. And Mackenzie, thank you for showing us your expertise, and you had all the fun stuff to do. I was doing the boring stuff, but thank you, Mackenzie.
Oh, you're welcome.
And folks, we will hopefully see you in a couple of weeks for the next session. Please register as soon as you can, because these are going to fill up very, very fast. Thank you. Bye.